Thank you very much. I'm going to, in my 25 minutes or so, I'm going to spend the first part of the paper just talking you through some of the work that I've done, and then I'll share a small PowerPoint. I wanted to really thank especially Matthew Ryan Robinson for the invitation, his persistent invitation to come and to join your conversation, and for the first two talks in the session, which I found incredibly helpful and illuminating. So I was asked to speak about my hopes for the future of our discipline of biblical studies. For some time, I've been engaged in problematizing the impulse to reconstruct the original as though one could arrive there, or other related impulses to redeem the text teleologically in some kind of end time or final redemption, impulse that replaces earlier expressions of religion and canon. It's an inspiration for the text, for the original, that often is authorized as a standard scholarly practice. We heard about this a little bit earlier today from Jeremy, but without much critique. Why is a backwards moving philology, or to reconstruct the past, more authoritative or more rigorous than a forward moving philological practice, which considers multiple iterations of texts, manuscripts, and which unfolds their performance over time in a dynamic and vital context? At the outset of his career, Nietzsche offered a critique of his own discipline. Philology, as Nietzsche saw it, is concerned not only with the formation of individual texts and collections, but also with the formation of individual subjects. And because philology is concerned with classical texts in Greek and Latin, to which special significance is ascribed, it deals with the texts that play a primary role in the formation of our culture. Consequently, philology should not be dry and dusty antiquarianism, but it should be placed within our own culture, a culture that critiques itself. And we heard about this a little bit in our second paper today. But philology can be such a place of openness only if it avoids narrow disciplinary confinement. And I would also say confessional confinement. That is, we're talking about texts that are shared by multiple communities and different religious traditions. But philology also needs to answer the call to critique itself by articulating and criticizing its own underlying presuppositions, its own philosophical worldview. Rigorous philology, then, is inseparable from what I have elsewhere called ethical reading. And here I think it's important that my account of ethical reading, I don't have time to discuss this today, but it's descriptive, not normative. So I'm not telling a church or a community or a synagogue how to live, but I'm using the text to think about descriptive ethics, a descriptive way of thinking about how to read and how to use texts. The earliest stage of biblical studies were inspired, shaped, and authored not by narrow specialists, but by philosophers, poets, and philologists. The disciplinary context for these founders and their forebears were in the university, for example, Leuth, Hobbes, Eichhorn, involving Germanist philosophers and classicists. It's important to mark, and it's important, this is a conference in Germany, that Germanistic, that German literature and German theory has been extremely important for my own thinking. And I know, and I've talked with Matthew about this, both Sandy and Schlegel, as well as Nietzsche, who will figure across the paper today. It's important to mark new and renewed beginnings for biblical studies, not only in the scientific study of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, New Testament, and Wissenschaft des Judentums, the study of Judaism, but also of the very disciplines from which biblical studies originated, from which students can continue to learn and to which we can continue to contribute. Biblical studies is not then a single discipline, but a dynamic matrix of many disciplines. It is inherently interdisciplinary, I want to suggest today. Indeed, the topic of my talk today is born out of the sense that biblical studies should never be constrained or exhausted by a single discrete discipline, language, or approach. Approached as a single discipline, then, biblical studies will lose its place in the academy, and along with that, its significance, retaining only the theological. Biblicists readily agree that the biblical traditions in the academy must be contextualized historically, culturally, and religiously. But one can also consider rhetoric, material philology, practices of reading, criticism, linguistics, since all of these various disciplines inform the way we read. This means that we as scholars may need to consider the movements and developments of the study of poetry and literature, as well as history and linguistics. And this was already pointed out in Jeremy's paper. Much of our literary approaches are borrowed from a much earlier iteration of these disciplines, like 19th century literary theory. And part of what I'm calling for here is to think with scholars of literature and with philosophers and with linguists, so we don't only adopt or engage in historical linguistics from 3 generations ago. It tends to become dogma in our field as a way of, instead of thinking about it as a lens through which we can read. So to be current and informed, but also more importantly, to be open to learn from the other's disciplinary contribution and to be able to read old and ancient texts afresh or anew. Biblicists focus on creating conditions for biblical studies then. We should focus on creating conditions for biblical studies to thrive within and to contribute to a growing and dynamic environment for the humanities and social sciences. That is, I'm calling upon us to create new conditions, not to mourn the demise of the humanities and biblical studies in the humanities. And I'm using explicitly the language of Emerson here about creating new conditions for the world in which we want to live and teach. Humanities could not be more essential than to the formation of biblical studies in the history of our university, broadly speaking, especially when scholars are reminded that the field of biblical philology was born as the twin of classical studies, together with Eichhorn and Wolff, who forged philology for both classics on the one hand and biblical studies and Jewish studies on the other. The relationship between the humanities and the social sciences is, of course, essential to our conversation, but there's an especially foundational and intimate relationship to classics that I want to highlight. To be sure, this isn't new. Anyone who's studied biblical Hebrew at a university from the Renaissance onwards had already studied Greek and Latin as part of her ordinary or earlier education. These 2 languages exercised a profound influence, of course, on the understanding and conceptualization of Hebrew grammar, of biblical poetry, and of genre. So to be between Hebrew and Greek is precisely the place for the creation of philological discourses. Time doesn't permit me today to really talk about how problematic that is. For example, the counting of meter in biblical Hebrew poetry and correcting it because it doesn't fit with the Greek model is something that's been problematized, notably by my own supervisor, James Kugel. But there are many such anachronistic impositions that we need to be worried about, but I nevertheless celebrate this relationship between Hebrew and Greek as siblings. One of the twins, to be sure, in the academy came to be privileged over the other, as Greek and Latin literature came to be regarded as establishing the paradigm for beauty, whereas the Hebrew Bible came to be seen as exhibiting a gradual decline that could either be continued by the rabbis, superseded by early Christianity, or redeemed by early Christianity, but it was fundamentally antithetical to the classical. And I do want to say that anti-Judaism, sadly and tragically, shaped much of biblical studies and helped create the conditions for political anti-Semitism. One might not want to reinforce an 18th century and 19th century idealization of the Greek past, but one does need to understand how this evaluative assessment continues to play a very important role in the world of biblical studies and classical studies. And here I'm the first Hebrew Bible or Old Testament scholar to speak in this session. And I really want to highlight that the problem that I'm describing is not only about the New Testament, it's also about the Old Testament. And in fact, I think New Testament studies is far more progressive in thinking through this problematic currently. In any event, the developments I describe call for an ethical self-critique of the sort envisioned by the young Nietzsche in his inaugural address. How do scholars come to know and understand practices of composition, of reading, of transmission of knowledge? How are not only texts and collections, but also the subjectivities of readers formed? These questions cannot be studied within a single isolated tradition, but must be considered across linguistic, cultural, and disciplinary boundaries. There is, of course, a reciprocal dimension to the work that's done in our discipline. One calls for an investigation of our own texts and related concepts with interaction with otherness. The texts that are studied can and even should have a voice and can model beauty, aesthetics, and the ethical, as well as the ugly and the compromised. So how and where we use these texts for constructive theological models is something that is both tempting, it's exciting, but it's also profoundly dangerous. There is always a temptation, though, to dig in our heels and to turn our own texts inward so that they are the possession of the few and the domain of disciplinary specialists. Alternatively, one can take an outward-looking and inclusive approach to the humanities writ large. What do we mean then when we speak of philology? To be sure, we speak of grammar and lexicography, but there are a whole host of cultural assumptions that biblicists, even writers of dictionaries and encyclopedias, carry with us when we practice philology. First, their institutional practices, as well as scholarly conceptions of language and development within their own registers and across contemporaneous cultural contexts. But also linked to these are scribal practices. Philology participates in the scientific knowledge of language and syntax, but also, along with that, are practices of reading and editing that demand investigation. To understand compositional interworkings in the assembly of a text, and here I mean the history of the development of a text, is also to understand that text across time, both with respect to its own production, composition, and with respect to its own development, its own vitality, its own reception. And I want to include these categories, which are already available to us from Greek and Latin poets and critics about interpolation, refinement, and part of what we've learned from the Dead Sea Scrolls, pluriformity. Practices of philology in our tradition participate then in the work of scribal activity, as well as traditions of performance. Scholarly practices of editing and interpretation are deeply engaged in this process of understanding and explanation. Philology then, biblical studies then, is inextricably linked to the world of hermeneutics. And to that end, scholars must be self-conscious, as Jeremy said a little over an hour ago, self-conscious of our own scholarly expectations and assumptions, of which we inevitably have many, whether or not we name them or self-consciously acknowledge them. My own comparative work in biblical studies considers practices of reading and interpretation alongside practices of language analysis. The goal of this kind of philology then is twofold: to understand the history of biblical texts and language with corresponding and related disciplines, and secondly, to integrate new insights into our practices of reading. Practices of philology then could be considered, perhaps must be considered, alongside practices of reading, which can be exemplified through interpretation and by studying reading practices and composition. So let me think about a variety of challenges in the second half of my paper. Asked me to talk a little bit about how some of my own work, I say some of my students are actually here in this community today, but I always say, like with Jeremiah, we break down, but we also have to build up. So when we expose what's missing in the field, we also have to show the payoff. Share a couple of, I don't have time to talk about a lot of things, but I'm going to share a couple of topics about the ways in which I've thought through and tried to move philology forward. So not only to critically engage my own work and the world in which I've been trained, but also to talk about what we might be able to do together. So let me see if I can share my screen here. Let's see, yeah, here we go. Let's give it a try. Okay. Okay, oops. Okay. So first, on attribution. So here I've talked a little bit about what the assumptions have been and where I tried to go. The assumption that something is not written by an historical figure or is a forgery, I argued against already in 1999 in some of my first essays. It was clear to me then, and is clear to me now, that pseudepigraphy was omnipresent in the biblical corpus. So to speak of something as spurious as opposed to genuine seemed not only anachronistic, but it also generated profound misunderstanding of how ancient biblical traditions grew and were composed. The obsession with historicity then meant that pseudonymous attribution was misunderstood as plagiarism or lying, instead of forgery, instead of a way of growing a tradition. Here I built on Foucault's understanding of author function, but also drawing on Barthes, Nietzsche, and especially Kierkegaard's account of pseudonymous attribution. So instead of the language of forgery, I suggested that we consider these traditions as discourses tied to founders, and I focused in particular on my own writings on the figure of Moses and Ezra, and more recently to the concept of chokhmah or sophia, to wisdom. Another way in which I've been thinking about this, and I've already alluded to this, of course, in the earlier part of my paper, I worried about the original or the ur-text, the original author and the original writer, or the first Moses or Homer or Jesus. The focus on retrospective reading focused on reconstruction, getting at the original or the essence. and the earliest moments of divine speech, the ipsissima verba, for example, natural religion. And I was worried very early on, even in my own training, in my doctoral work at Harvard, about the way J was idealized, right, as a way of actually getting at the essence of deity. I was suggesting in my earlier work that there were theological and historicist impulses underlying many of these expressions. So then I tried to suggest that what we could do is turn to compositional practices and focus on what I call traditionary processes as a way of thinking about forward-moving and growing traditions. This would also involve reading prospectively and thinking about the growth and development of biblical traditions. I mean, part of what I found was that by freezing a text, one couldn't understand its life and the way in which it was generative for multiple communities. And here I don't only mean theological communities, I do mean a series of different religious communities, but I'm also thinking about scholarly communities that inherit and read and work with the texts. In addition to an explicit critique of the state of affairs in current scholarship that subscribes, for example, to a neo-documentarian approach, and here I'm being very specific about Pentateuchal studies, I wanted to think about, there are many other ways of thinking about the organization or fortribum, the organization and the delineation of different levels of a text as a kind of archaeological site. I wanted to think about a forward-moving practice which could be demonstrated in the Hebrew Bible. And this is as well as other texts from the biblical materials beyond the canon itself. And this is what one could call a larger discourse about compositional history and what I've called vitality of scripture or vitality of texts through their own pluriformity, by watching texts grow across linguistic registers and by watching text grow even with their own linguistic registers, as we've come to understand from the Dead Sea Scrolls that there are variation that don't compromise the integrity of the text, but are generative for the integrity of the text. And I'm happy to explain that more in the Q&A if you want to. But here my focus is not only Pentateuch, but also works such as Jubilees or Jeremiah, works such as Second Esdras, as well as Psalms and Proverbs. To be sure, these various collections in biblical books are not uniformly the same in any way. While Proverbs might be considered anthological, Jeremiah might be considered a collection of the oracular and the historiographical around the figure of Jeremiah. So instead of focusing on differentiating different genre or kinds of collections or assemblies, this essay here today takes a progressive approach to composition. And I've proposed a progressive approach focusing on compositional history as a way of capturing a kind of proposal for reading forward. I want to read with my students, with my own readers, in a way that considers the history of documents and at the same time makes sense of what it is to read the whole of a composite text. It's not a straightforward matter to read a text with complex history with compositional layers. So I don't want to deny any of that. Our texts have deep and complex history. But scholars may acknowledge that all texts have history, so even the most ancient readings reflect histories of editing and deletions. But texts such as Exodus or Jubilees, as well as Jeremiah, can show the way in which these texts are embedded as part of a whole of what Nietzsche called a textual unity. Again, time doesn't permit me to say a lot about this today, except that part of what I'm doing, for example, in a new piece I just wrote about P and non-P, in Pentateuchal materials, to talk about how that also is a sign of vitality, not disunity and not a sick text, that we can understand the history of preserving traditions that are in tension with one another as a way of generating a new discourse that has a very big tent for multiple voices already in the biblical materials themselves. And I've started to talk to New Testament scholars about thinking about this characterization along with the quote unquote synoptic problem, but I'll leave that to my New Testament colleagues here. To compose an antiquity then was to record tradition, but also to read existing tradition and to engage with it. Ancient writers and readers perhaps knew how these texts came about, and they were committed not to producing a seamless linear narrative, but to preserving difference. This integrated mode of reading can contribute to understanding a whole, and thus pave the way to a new hermeneutic for the reading of biblical narrative. And here I'm alluding very implicitly to Sandi's account of poetic processes in his work on Hölderlin and Celan. And I'm trying to apply some of that to think about a unity or a poetic unity of collection. To be sure, I'm also indebted here to Nietzsche's critique of how Homer was dissected. So my proposal here is a philology of hermeneutics that presupposes both the rigors of etymology and grammar, but moves beyond that by applying it to a practice of reading, which is intricate and interwoven with respect to a collection or a work. So the notion, which I've talked about elsewhere, which is borrowed from Benjamin, of the life after text, or the vitality of scripture, borrowing on this notion of Überleben from Benjamin, is a way of signaling a continuation of a textual tradition in the context of rereading, and as a way of understanding what is alive in writing. Current scholarship suggests that the first group of readers of biblical texts were the very same as the community of authors. That is, the readers are composers, or they are themselves the collectors and editors. To compose then in antiquity was to record tradition, but also to read existing tradition and to engage with it. The ancient writers and readers perhaps knew how these texts came about. Oops, sorry. Perhaps knew how these texts came about. And they were committed not to producing a seamless linear narrative, but nevertheless paving a new way for hermeneutics. 1 second. Oops, yeah. So I also spent some time rethinking generic categories. I've argued against categories that reduce a single work to a single genre with fixed features. This is related to the idea of getting to an earlier or original text or original core of a text to get at a pristine genre. And I've, in considering texts that create new generic discourses, but I've wanted to defy the categorization or generalizability. And here too, Benjamin has been extremely helpful, as well as Stanley Cavell, in thinking about genre construction. For Benjamin, and here I did this in my 4th Ezra book, I called on the notion of constellation, and he and myself also borrowing from Weber. It wasn't a set of criteria or generalizable features, rather particular elements of a constellation exhibited in the exemplary particular enabled one to employ the idea or to illuminate other particulars. So for example, in calling a text apocalyptic, we can lose a lot of the texture of that tradition by missing out on how there are many ways in which these very same texts can be characterized as wisdom or liturgy and also prophecy. So-called apocalyptic texts like 4Q Instruction or 4th Ezra have often been obscured more than they've been illuminated by this label, by this generic label. My critique then is of scholarship which generalizes the claim of the end of prophecy, which facilitates the scholarly narrative of the death of prophecy or the death of spirit in Judaism. And this is something I've developed elsewhere, but I thought I would use this as a way of illustrating what I mean by problematizing genre, looking at these categories and then talking about religious divides. This bait and switch between prophecy and apocalyptic, which was said to eclipse all other oracular expression, is problematized, at least in part because of the way in which the history of our field was shaped by an already formed understanding of the end of spirit for a Judaism which became nothing less than Spät Judentum. And here I'm thinking about an important article that was published by Konrad Schmid on the rise and fall of the notion of Spät Judentum in Christian biblical scholarship. This narrative of Spät Judentum, as Schmid describes, is a Judaism which is no longer alive to prophecy or to the word of God, and was reduced to scribalism and to textuality or legalistic interpretation, as opposed to charismatic revelation. The endurance of orality or performance in the midst of an emerging textualized culture, what I've called vitality, kept Judaism alive as a religion which repeatedly articulated creative innovation through composition, authoritative interpretation, and even new law. All of this was performed as a repeated engagement with a representation of both Sinai and creation. And I just use this as one example, and I have many such examples, and I wanted to show what's lost, right? What's lost if we talk about only reconstructing the past. So this picks up on my earlier points also. So here, so the originary moments and forgery, all it's meant to kind of, I'm just moving back forward again through my slides to kind of show this moving trajectory. So part of what I hope to do in my work is to rethink canonical boundaries and instead think in terms of inside and outside the Bible, or the normative and the sectarian. I've written about this elsewhere, but the canon as we know it, as the Old Testament, whether it's the Pshita or it's the Septuagint or it's the Tanakh, is a later construct, by which I don't mean that it's not genuine and generative for religious community, but what I mean is that we need to worry about it when we think about antiquity, because there are many members of this community of texts, if we can think about them as alive, that were participating and contributing to the formation of biblical texts that are outside, of course, of our current canon of the Old Testament. I like to rethink not only the way we talk about what's inside and outside of the canon, but also the way we think about how we name the texts that are outside and name the texts that are inside. For example, people will say that there's pseudepigraphy outside, or even the pseudepigrapha, but if one is talking about pseudepigrapha in Isaiah, people get very, very nervous, where we know that it's not all attributed to Isaiah. And I've been really surprised at how uncomfortable people are with this notion of pseudepigraphy, of course, because it's considered to be isomorphic with forgery, which I've argued it is not. And I've written elsewhere about nomenclature with my colleague Ibert Tichelaar, thinking about how we name, or perhaps need to rename, texts, for example, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, something that's pseudo-Ezekiel or pseudo-Jeremiah or reworked Pentateuch. These are very, very charged terms. I don't even need to go to the other places of where we have language that invokes a monastic community or an early rabbinic community or a mystical community. We use terms from later forms of Jewish and Christian monasticism and mysticism as a way of marking what these texts are. So we have to be very careful with our own nomenclature and possibly rethink it. I believe it's essential that we take on board what the scrolls have to teach us, the Dead Sea Scrolls have to teach us about rethinking our past. Instead of thinking about fixity and originary moments, I've been trying to work on terms such as articulation and performance. By way of conclusion, and this was a promise I made to Matthew, I wanted to talk a little bit about what I've meant by ethical reading. What I've meant, and I said this at the very beginning of my talk, as a descriptive practice of growing the self, and I've written quite a bit, and I continue to work on a project of selfhood with a whole host of colleagues across different disciplines and subdisciplines through reading and performing, but also, I mean by ethical reading, creating new texts and being transformed by them. And that's part of the experience of reading the text and the self. All along, we are marked and shaped by that past reciprocally. And there's a poem that, because I'm speaking in a German context, I think you'll all know it well, is Rilke's Apollo's Torso. At the very end, right, he calls upon us to rethink ourselves as we rethink about how to reconstruct Apollo. And I think this is very important to think about what's at stake and the way in which we're implicated in our work as readers and as scholars. Our practices of reading are practices of writing, but they're also opportunities to expand and to express hope, tikva, or elpis. This is a hope that keeps our texts alive, while at the same time remembers that we can never recover originary moments any more than we can predict the future. And I say by way of warning that it's also a dangerous activation. So we have to be careful when we activate or use texts in light of their violent history, but also in light of the ways in which we're disconnected from that biblical past. And we may not agree with a lot of the presuppositions that are operative in that text. That doesn't mean that this was used earlier in one of the talks, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We don't reject the text or hate on biblical texts because they don't align with the development. And here, I think there's a real ethical and optimistic development in the history of Western civilization. So there's also a lot of disconnects, a fragment, and I want to talk for a moment about fragmentation. The philology that I envisage seeks to reimagine the past life that animated the texts in their dynamism, all the while acknowledging that our imagination can never revive the dead and that our work must always remain fragmentary, in the words of Schlegel, and untimely, in the words of Nietzsche. Friedrich Schlegel, I think, is still one of the deepest thinkers about philology, and he wrote, many works of the ancients have become fragments. Many works of the moderns are fragments from the moment of their emergence. His point was that all works in some sense are fragmentary, whether ancient or modern, whether physically intact or not, since their meanings depend in part on what is supplied by the reader. Instead of stating a thesis, however, in a way that would seem to claim completeness, Schlegel is ironic as he formulates an epigram that invites the reader to reflect and thereby to enact the fragmentariness of the work. To read ethically, I'd like to suggest today then, is to read with the humility of our own fragmentariness, and at the same time with hope, optimism, with confidence that we can read again, that we can articulate new meaning responsibly, with philological sensitivity and what I want to call radical optimism about the texts that we read and texts which continue to give life anew in new linguistic registers, through new translations, through new hermeneutical insights, all along taking into account and taking responsibility for the history of these texts and their interpretations in different communities, in different religious and intellectual contexts. Hence, what I mean by forward-moving philology is about imagining a vibrant and vital voice for biblical studies, which contributes to and learns from the humanities. Thank you.